circles, I find that very word-centered, but I also find that people are very bored, meaning that they're just kind of coasting along. They're in their spiritual kind of complacency. They got all their comforts, and there's not a longing. I mean, there is like an internal longing for more, but they go to the churches, and the churches are just trying to, in many ways, just trying to stay afloat. I mean, they're trying to manage all of the different things going on culturally. And I just don't see the focus on prayer meetings. I don't see the focus on encountering God. I see, and I hate to say this in some circles, not all, but more of a manufactured joy. And there's this, we're going to just kind of drum it up rather than just a byproduct of true revival. And I remember reading an article some time ago where they said, we've traded prayer for posting online. And we've traded spiritual practices sometimes for protest. Now, sometimes there's necessary for protest. I'm not saying there's not, but oftentimes we go to the external rather than go into your Father and pray to your Father who is in secret, and he will reward you. And in our very kind of narcissistic branding culture, I mean, it just is what it is. I feel like we've got a lot of activity, but I remember hearing a pastor from Northern Ireland say years ago, we're like a bird in a cage, a lot of activity, but no progress. And yet it seems like if we're ever going to advance, we have to recover that heart for God. And I mean, because we can't do it ourselves. Right. And you guys talk about that. You actually mentioned consecration, something that I don't hear very often in the circles that I've been in. Why the focus on consecration and putting oneself at the availability of God to touch and move? Well, I mean, why consecration again? What brought that up?
Yeah, it's the entry. The consecration marks the 4 C's that we talk about in the book. Consecration, calling, contending, and character. And it really is that
very
sort of
pastoral right there. Very pastoral. I'm going to steal that.
That's right.
And give you no credit.
Presbyterian father.
That's right. You got all the alliteration right there, and then you got to do it like Jesse Jackson. Then you go. We got consecration. You got to do that, and then we got calling, and you keep going. So
that's right. I
mean, keep going. So consecration.
So yeah, and so it is the entry place. It's an admitting that what you're experiencing right now is not what you're meant for. It's an admission that there's a gap between what life in the kingdom could be and where you're at, and there will always be this gap on this side of heaven. But it is a place where we say, for this season, I want to be set apart. And just sort of like any consecration, when you're consecrating the items for the temple, or you're consecrating people, you're basically just saying, I'm setting this apart for this season, and say, God, all right, it's creating a space or a room for God to speak more clearly and more powerfully. And it's that, right? That's sort of the litmus. Like when we talk about even power, one way, the entry place for us in university is it's about listening. That's all we're asking people to do is, do you listen to God? Like one litmus test I often have is like, well, when people are saying like, well, my spiritual life, it's not very strong, or I'm not feeling very vibrant. I say, well, when was the last time God spoke to you that you understood? And that doesn't necessarily mean like an audible voice, just a sense that God gave you some direct connection. And those who are vibrant, they've got something in the last 2 months they could talk about how God said this, or spoke to this, or spoke through that sermon, or through this song. There's something about God speaking through that. And then for those where it's just dried up, it's been like years since they heard something from the Lord, which is kind of nuts, right? Like if you think about how we, at least in evangelical circles, we talk about a relationship with God. And yet in practice, we make it more about a philosophy of life, these principles and these rules that we follow. But the relationship, if it's a relationship, and this is Dallas Willard speaking, right? If it's a relationship, shouldn't there be two-way communication? Because we would never settle for a relationship that's just one way. And so what would it look like for us to have those spaces where we're not just reading the word, but the word reads us, right? It's a place where we're listening to sermons, but it's not that we're just hearing it and comprehending it. We are sensing what God is saying through that for us now.